Sebastian Cole walked into the waiting room with a 6-year-old holding his left hand and a worn canvas bag over his right shoulder. 20 candidates. Suits. Broad shoulders. Thick necks. Every one of them looked up. Then someone laughed. A man in the front row said it loud enough for the whole room. "Hey buddy, this is a bodyguard tryout, not a preschool." Sebastian didn't answer. He walked to the far corner, sat down on the floor, and tied Abigail's shoes. 3 hours later, Oliver Drake, the man no one had put down in 2 years, was face down on the mat. Nobody laughed after that. They saw a single father who didn't belong. They never saw what was underneath. Follow now. You'll want to know how this ends. Sebastian Cole bowed his head into the refrigerator and counted what was left. 3 eggs, half a carton of oat milk, a sleeve of crackers that Abigail had already worked through the bottom third of. He closed the door and stood in the quiet kitchen of their Southside apartment, while the city outside barely stirred. It was 5:30 in the morning, and the light through the window was the pale, uncertain kind that never quite committed to being day. He had woken at 5, the way he always did, no alarm, no gradual drift into consciousness, just a clean vertical line between sleep and awake, a habit his body had kept long after the life that formed it was over. He made oatmeal. He set the bowl on Abigail's side of the small table with a spoon and a folded paper towel, the way she liked it. Then he turned to the refrigerator and studied the tally in his head until the numbers stopped moving. There was a flyer pinned to the door with a magnet shaped like a sunflower. Abigail had put it there herself, pressing it flat with both palms the way a child seals something official. She had seen him reading it 3 nights ago and said nothing, only smoothed the paper corners down and gone back to her coloring book. The flyer read, Voss Capital Private, Wealth Personal Security, Director $8,500 per month full family health coverage. The last line had been traced over in red pen, twice. Sebastian had done that. He did not remember doing it, but there it was. Abigail had been diagnosed with mild asthma 11 months ago. The private insurance had lapsed in February. He had applied to 3 security firms since then, filling out the forms carefully, listing his training and his service years in the measured, factual language those forms required. None of them had called back. What they saw, when they looked at the bottom of his resume, was 2 years of self-employed plumbing repair. What they did not see was what those 2 years covered, and why. He heard the small feet on the hallway floor at 7, and then Abigail appeared in the kitchen doorway, her dark hair pressed flat on one side, and her stuffed bear, Biscuit, held against her chest with both arms. Biscuit was a small brown bear, with one eye that had been resewn slightly higher than the other, which gave the bear a permanently quizzical expression. Abigail had owned Biscuit since she was 14 months old. The bear had been washed so many times the fur had gone soft as flannel. "Morning," Abigail said. "Morning, Abby." Oatmeal's on the table. She climbed into her chair and pulled the bowl close. She ate carefully, the way she did most things, with a methodical attention that sometimes made Sebastian forget she was 6 years old. When she was halfway through the bowl, the phone rang. He answered it in the kitchen doorway. The woman who kept Abigail during the mornings, a retired teacher 2 floors up, had a scratchy voice and a cough she was apologizing for, even before she got to the point. Abigail had run a fever the day before, she said. Just a precaution. Sebastian stood with the phone in his hand after the call ended and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He got Abigail's backpack from the hook by the door. He put Biscuit inside. He found the small coloring book and tucked it in beside the bear, with a bundle of colored pencils held together by a rubber band. He zipped the pack and knelt to tie Abigail's shoes, while she stood patiently with one hand on his shoulder. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Dad has a tryout today." She considered this. "Are you going to win?" He pulled the laces snug and looked up at her. "I'm going to try." She nodded, accepting this as sufficient, and went to retrieve her bear from the backpack, because she had decided she wanted to carry it herself. The building that housed Voss Capital occupied the upper 14 floors of a glass tower on the north side of downtown. The lobby was marble and cool, and the security desk was manned by 2 people in matching navy jackets. Sebastian came through the revolving door at 8:53 with Abigail's hand in his left hand and a worn canvas tote bag over his right shoulder. He was wearing a polo shirt the pale green of hospital corridors, washed many times, and dark trousers that fit well, because they had once been part of something better. He had not worn a suit in 3 years, and did not own one anymore. The waiting area for the candidates was a long room off the main lobby with leather chairs and bottled water arranged on a low table. There were 20 men already seated when Sebastian walked in. Most of them wore dark suits or tactical cut shirts that displayed their builds with architectural precision. Several had the particular stillness of men trained to observe rooms, and they observed this one now specifically, the door through which Sebastian and Abigail had just entered. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. A man in a gray suit near the front, broad-shouldered, shoes polished to a high finish, the kind of handsome that knew it was handsome, leaned slightly toward the man beside him and said, at a volume calibrated to carry, "I thought this was a security tryout, not a daycare." Several people laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Sebastian did not look at the man. He scanned the room once left to right, door positions, sight lines, and then led Abigail to the corner farthest from the entrance, where a stretch of wall offered the clearest view of both exits. He sat on the floor with his back to the wall and settled Abigail beside him. He took the coloring book from her pack, opened it to the page with the rabbit, and handed her the bundle of pencils. "You can do the rabbit," he said. She pulled out the brown pencil and began. A young woman from the front desk approached with the particular expression of someone who had been sent to do something uncomfortable. She told him, politely, that the space was not designed for children. Sebastian looked at her steadily. "I understand," he said. "If whoever's running this wants to ask me to leave, I'd like them to do that in person. I'll wait." The woman blinked, then retreated into the corridor beyond the desk. A man in the second row, the largest man in the room, with close-cropped hair, and the focused stillness of someone who had spent years being the most capable person in any given space, looked at Sebastian once. Not a glance, a professional assessment. Quick and thorough. Then he looked away. His name was Oliver Drake, and he had not lost a controlled sparring match in 2 years. He had also, in that single look, concluded that the man in the corner with the child presented no competitive interest whatsoever. On the second floor, behind a panel of one-way glass, Eleanor Voss stood with her arms folded and watched the room below. She was 28, with dark hair pulled back precisely, and a navy blazer over a white shirt that she had worn buttoned to the second-to-last button since sometime in her early 20s, because someone had once told her it looked severe, and she had decided that was the point. She ran a private wealth management fund valued at $2.4 billion, and she had done so since she was 26, when her predecessor retired, and the board had looked at every available option, and then looked at her and decided she was the least risky one. She had been proving them right ever since, which was a different thing from being thanked for it. Richard Crane stood beside her with a clipboard and the easy confidence of a man who believed he was the most important person in any room he entered, which was not always wrong. He was 45 and had been with the firm for 9 years and had spent the last 18 months positioning himself as the adult supervision behind Eleanor's instincts. He did not say this out loud. He said things like, "My concern is the board's exposure, and let me run the operational side of this, and Eleanor, you have enough on your plate." He was walking through the candidate list now. Oliver Drake first, as expected. Former Marines, amateur combatives record, exemplary background. He recommended shortlisting 5 candidates and accelerating to practical evaluation. Eleanor was looking at the corner of the room, specifically at the man sitting on the floor with a child, pointing at something in a coloring book that made the child tip her head and smile. "The man in the corner," she said. "What does his file say?" Richard scrolled. Sebastian Cole. No recent professional security experience. 2 years of independent contracting in building maintenance and repair. Prior to that, there are some gaps. Possible data entry issues. "Possible," Eleanor said. "You want to cut him?" "I can have someone." "No," she said. "Leave him in." Richard made a note on his clipboard, with the expression of a man filing something under things to revisit later. Eleanor turned back toward her desk. She did not explain herself. She rarely did. The first evaluation round took place in a third-floor conference room. Colonel Webb, a retired Army officer who consulted for the firm on security matters, distributed a printed scenario to each candidate. A principal exiting a hotel, while 3 vehicles created a rolling block on the primary route, eastern egress compromised. 4 minutes. Write your response. The room went quiet, except for the sound of pens. Matthew Briggs, the gray suit, the polished shoes, wrote quickly and read his answer aloud when time was called. It was correct. Textbook. Delivered with the ease of someone who had done well in school and knew it. Several people nodded. Matthew caught their nods and collected them. Oliver Drake wrote 6 lines and turned his paper over and waited. Sebastian wrote. He wrote his initial response in the first 2 minutes, then spent the remaining time drawing a small diagram in the upper corner of the page 3 angles, 2 fallback positions, a note about wind direction affecting auditory surveillance on the eastern side, a secondary variable about whether the block vehicles had commercial or private plates, and what that implied about coordination level. Colonel Webb moved through the papers at the end. He paused at Sebastian's. He read it twice. He placed it face down on the desk and moved on without comment, but he placed it differently from the others. Sebastian noticed. He did not react. Abigail, meanwhile, was in a small side room off the main corridor, where Grace Kim, Eleanor's personal assistant, 27, with the calm efficiency of someone who had decided very early to be indispensable, had offered to sit with her while the evaluations continued. Abigail accepted this arrangement with characteristic gravity, spreading her coloring book on the low table and beginning a new page. After a while, she looked up at Grace. "Is my dad good at his job?" she asked. Grace thought about this carefully. "I'm still finding out," she said. Abigail nodded and went back to her coloring. "He's good at most things," she said, as a clarification, not a boast. The physical assessment ran in the basement gym timed run, pull-ups, load carry across 40 meters, reaction speed test on an electronic console. Sebastian placed 6th in the composite. Matthew Briggs placed 3rd, Oliver Drake placed 1st, and neither of them was breathing hard at the end. When the reaction speed console cycled through its sequence, a light panel that flashed in irregular intervals and required the user to strike the corresponding pad, Sebastian registered a response time of 0.19 seconds. The technician running the board looked at the number. He cleared the console and ran it again. The result was 0.19 seconds. He wrote it down without saying anything, then stared at his clipboard for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Matthew noticed the pause. He looked at Sebastian across the room. Sebastian was already moving toward the water station. Matthew said nothing, but his expression had changed slightly the way a room's temperature changes before weather arrives. The combat evaluation was last. Colonel Webb explained the rules in the basement gym, while the remaining 12 candidates stood in a loose arc. The objective was control, not damage, contain, and neutralize a simulated threat. Points for technique, economy of movement, time to resolution. Oliver Drake would serve as the evaluation anchor, rotating through challengers. Oliver went first against a man named Torres, who lasted 38 seconds, then a former Secret Service contractor who made it to 41, then a candidate named Pearson, who attempted a hip throw that Oliver reversed in under 3 seconds and turned into a wrist lock that left Pearson tapping twice, fast, before his knees hit the mat. Nobody spoke during this, the kind of quiet that falls on a room when it has collectively understood something. Matthew Briggs went forth. He was skilled, genuinely, his footwork was clean and his guard was tight, and he lasted 32 seconds before Oliver locked his far arm and walked him down to the mat with the patient efficiency of a man filing paperwork. Matthew got up, brushed the mat fibers from his suit, and looked around the room with the particular expression of a man recalibrating his ego in real time. His eyes landed on Sebastian. "Hey," he said. The word carried across the room like a hand on a shoulder. "Single dad. You're up. Or did you want to go home and pick up your kid first?" A few people laughed. Fewer than before. Sebastian set down his water bottle. He walked onto the mat. He removed his watch, a plain plastic watch, the kind sold in pharmacy checkout aisles, and placed it in the corner of the mat with the care of someone setting down something worth keeping. Then he stood in the center, hands loose at his sides, and looked at Oliver Drake. Oliver approached from Sebastian's right, which was where he always started. He was 6'2" and 215 pounds, and he moved with the economy of a man for whom physicality had long since become fluent. He came in for a rear collar tie, the kind of entry that let him read resistance before committing to a takedown. His hands found their position, and he began to feel for the response. Sebastian's left shoulder dropped a 1/4 inch. It was not a flinch, it was a redirect. Oliver's trailing arm, the one he used for leverage, suddenly had no leverage because the shoulder it was pulling against had dissolved out of its expected position. In the same motion, Sebastian's right hand closed on Oliver's elbow from a direction that did not exist in Oliver's muscle memory, applying pressure at an angle that was not painful but was structurally absolute. Move, or something breaks. Oliver's instinct, trained across thousands of hours, told him to rotate his core and drive forward, to use his weight. He did. Sebastian let him. Specifically, he let Oliver's forward momentum carry Oliver past Sebastian's center line, which was a small thing to permit and had enormous consequences, because once a man of Oliver's size committed his weight in a direction and found no resistance, he was briefly, entirely, somewhere he had not planned to be. Sebastian's right foot swept, not hard, simply placed, at precisely the point where Oliver's weight was briefly unsupported. Oliver went down. He went down in a controlled line because Sebastian was guiding him even as he fell, one hand on his collar, one hand on his wrist, and Oliver arrived on the mat, face down, with Sebastian's knee between his shoulder blades and his wrist held at an angle that communicated, clearly and without commentary, that the range of available actions had been reduced to 7 seconds from first contact. The room was completely silent. Oliver breathed steadily. He was a man who had been in enough real situations to know the difference between a technique and a practitioner, and what had just been done to him was not technique in the way technique was usually meant. He turned his head slightly, enough to speak. "Delta?" he said, quietly. "Just for Sebastian." Sebastian said nothing. He released Oliver's wrist and stood and offered him his hand. Oliver looked at the hand for a long moment. Then he took it. In the hallway outside the gym, Abigail stood on her toes against the small rectangular window in the door. Biscuit pressed to her sternum. She had heard the silence fall in the room even through the door. She could see her father standing in the center of the mat with everyone still and looking at him. "He didn't lose," she said. Gray stood behind her, looking through the window over the top of Abigail's head. "No," she said. "He didn't." Abigail turned around and held Biscuit up. "Biscuit knew," she said. 40 minutes later, on the 12th floor, Eleanor Voss sat at her desk with a file that was not the file Richard had accessed. The firm's legal team had run a federal background query after the reaction speed result routine for any candidate whose numbers fell outside normal parameters. What came back was not a data entry error. What came back was a clearance flag that required a secondary request. Eleanor had signed the secondary request herself. Sebastian Cole, Sergeant First Class. 1st, Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. 8 years of service. 3 combat deployments. 2 commendations. 1 classified operation. Summary redacted, available only to personnel with specific authorization. Voluntary separation from service, submitted 6 weeks after his wife's death in an automobile accident. Abigail had been 2 years old. Eleanor read the separation reason twice. It said, family obligation, sole caregiver, minor child. She set the file flat on her desk and looked out the window for a moment at the city below. It was still morning. The light had finally decided to be day. Grace appeared in the doorway. He's in the hall outside, if you want to speak with him. Abigail is asleep on the bench, still holding the bear on her chest. Eleanor stood and walked to the door. Sebastian was standing in the corridor outside the waiting bench where Abigail lay asleep, her cheek against her own forearm and biscuit rising and falling with her breathing. He was not sitting. He was standing with his back angled slightly toward the hall, his gaze making a slow, automatic sweep of the corridor in both directions, not with visible tension, just with the steady attention of someone for whom awareness had long since stopped requiring effort. He noticed Eleanor before she was fully in the doorway. He turned. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Why did you apply for this position?" "Health coverage," he said. "My daughter needs family health coverage. The salary gets us the rest of the way." She was quiet for 3 seconds. In Eleanor Voss's professional life, 3 seconds of silence from her was something people noticed and discussed afterward. Before she could speak again, an alert tone cut through the floor, not the building fire signal, which was different, but the internal security notification, a low double tone that sounded twice and then stopped. Grace appeared at the end of the corridor at a fast walk. "A package was delivered to this floor," Grace said. "It didn't clear the lobby checkpoint. The lobby camera has a gap in the log, 8 minutes. Sebastian was already moving. He stepped between Eleanor and the corridor before she had processed the sentence. "Don't touch it," he said. "Stand against the interior wall, the one without windows. Grace, call building security and tell them to lock the elevators from the lobby side. Don't send anyone up. I need them positioned below." Grace pulled out her phone. Sebastian walked to the package at the corridor junction. He examined it without tools. Hands flat, reading it by touch and geometry the way a person reads a page. He looked at it for 45 seconds. Then, he stepped back. "Not a device," he said. "Open it?" Eleanor nodded. Inside the padded envelope was a photograph. Eleanor, leaving the building the previous evening, through the rear exit. The image was taken from ground level, from a position that would have been inside the building's camera perimeter if the camera had been facing the correct direction. Underneath the photograph was a sheet of plain paper with 4 words typed in the center. "Next time. Much closer." And then Richard Crane was in the corridor, arriving from the direction of the stairwell with his jacket buttoned and his expression calibrated precisely to the frequency of concerned colleague, not too panicked, not too controlled, the exact register of a man who had prepared for this moment. "Eleanor," he said, "I just heard. Are you all right?" I had already asked security downstairs to tighten the entry protocol. I should have followed up. Sebastian looked at Richard once. It was a brief look, a flat look, the kind that took inventory rather than offered opinion. Richard met it for a moment, then turned his eyes back to Eleanor with the smooth ease of a man used to managing the room. Sebastian said nothing. He turned back to the envelope and stood looking at it. Eleanor noticed the look Sebastian had given Richard. She did not say anything about it then. The building's security team arrived 6 minutes later. Statements were taken. The photograph and note were bagged. Eleanor declined to leave Norbert to leave the floor until her 4 o'clock call was complete, and Oliver Drake was assigned as interim protective presence for the afternoon. Sebastian was thanked. The word used was thanked, not hired, not contracted, and told that the selection process would conclude in the morning. He took Abigail home. She had woken on the bench when the security team arrived and was now fully alert, holding Biscuit and watching the uniformed people move through the corridor. With the careful attention of a child who understood something important was happening, but not what. In the elevator, she looked up at Sebastian. "Did something bad happen? Someone sent a letter they shouldn't have sent," he said. "Working on it." She took his hand, and they rode the rest of the way down in silence. He parked the car in the building's basement level at 7:45 that evening, the same structure, because the plumbing supply run he had used as his reason for returning was real enough, a delivery he'd been waiting 3 days for. He had Abigail asleep in the back seat with Biscuit, and a blanket he kept folded in the rear footwell for exactly this circumstance. He locked the car and stood outside it for a moment. Then he walked the perimeter of the parking level. He noticed the camera on the eastern support column on his second circuit. He had clocked it on the first pass as well, but needed the second pass to be certain. The camera bracket had been adjusted, not replaced, adjusted by approximately 15 degrees. It was a small change, the kind a maintenance worker could accomplish in under a minute with a hex key. The change created a blind zone approximately 12 feet wide, centered on the primary elevator bank. Sebastian stood in the blind zone and looked at it from the inside. He called Grace. At 9:47, Eleanor crossed the lobby with Oliver Drake behind her and took the elevator to the parking structure. Oliver's vehicle was on level 2. Eleanor's driver was on level 3. They stepped out of the elevator on level 2, and Sebastian was already there, leaning against a concrete column with his arms folded and his eyes on the far end of the row. Oliver reacted before he processed who it was. His hand moved and his weight shifted, and he had already committed to action when Sebastian raised one open palm, not fast, just open, and said quietly, "It's me." Oliver's hand dropped. He exhaled through his nose. "Cole, camera 4 was adjusted," Sebastian said. "Blind zone 12 feet across." Starting at the elevator, Eleanor was looking at Sebastian. "How did you know to come back?" "The package," he said. The gap in the camera log was 8 minutes. That's not enough time to adjust a camera, deliver a package, and leave from street level. It was adjusted earlier in the day. Someone who had access to this structure. I wanted to see the camera myself. She looked at him for a long moment. "You aren't on the payroll yet." "I know." From the blind zone's edge, 2 men emerged walking fast, dark clothing, caps pulled low, moving with the particular directional certainty of people who had been told exactly where their target would be. Oliver stepped forward. Sebastian stepped left, cutting the angle. Oliver took the first man. Sebastian took the second. It was over in 11 seconds. Both men were on the ground, face down, wrists controlled, when the building's security team came through the stairwell door 40 seconds later. Sebastian and Oliver were both standing. Eleanor had not moved from the wall. Sebastian had placed her there with one hand in the first, second, a single motion. Precise and impersonal. The way you close a door against weather. She had stayed exactly where he put her. When he came back to her, she looked at him. Her breathing was steady, but her jaw was set, and her hands were flat against the concrete wall behind her, pressing into it the way a person presses into something solid when they need to know it's real. "The camera," she said. "Yes. You caught it in one walkthrough?" He didn't answer. It was not a question that needed one. In the morning, Grace submitted a secondary records request on the maintenance access log for the parking structure. Sorted by time of entry, The camera on the eastern column had been adjusted at 5:12 in the afternoon, using a key card issued to a facilities contractor who had been added to the building's access roster 11 days earlier. The authorization for that addition had been signed by Richard Crane. Eleanor asked Grace to look further. It took Grace until afternoon. The contractor's payments, 3 of them, spaced across 2 months, originated from a holding company registered in Delaware. The holding company shared a mailing address with a private acquisition fund that had made 3 separate offers to purchase Voss Capital in the past 14 months. Eleanor had declined all 3. Richard Crane had been present at each negotiation. He was the only person outside of Eleanor and the fund's principals who knew the full terms of each rejected offer. There was also, on the contractor's phone, a recorded call. 12 seconds. The voice was Richard's. The contractor's voice confirmed the timing of the camera adjustment. Grace had obtained the record through the firm's internal investigation authority, which Eleanor had signed 2 hours after the parking structure incident. It was clean. It was legal. It was enough. Eleanor scheduled an emergency board session for the following afternoon. Sebastian was in the meeting room that morning. Eleanor had asked him, using the specific words temporary security consultant, which was not a real title and both of them knew it. He sat against the wall in the second chair from the door, while Richard walked the room through a professional-grade security review of the incident, noting failures in the lobby protocol, recommending enhancements to visitor verification, speaking in the measured, expert cadence of a man who had thought carefully about what to say. At one point, Richard proposed a new camera placement protocol for the parking structure. He cited 3 industry standards. His reasoning was airtight. Sebastian shook his head. It was barely a movement, just a slow lateral shift of his chin, small enough that only Eleanor, seated at the head of the table with a clear sight line to the wall, would catch it. She caught it. After the room cleared, she closed the door and set a folder on the table in front of Sebastian. Not the security review, the financial records. "Tell me what you saw in there," she said. Sebastian was quiet for a moment. When someone already knows how a problem was caused, they don't study the problem, he said. They study the people studying it. He was watching faces, not the board. And when he got to the camera proposal, he never looked at the camera diagram. He had the answer before the question. Eleanor looked at the folder. "He's been here 9 years, she said. "That's a long time to be patient." The board session convened at 2 o'clock the following afternoon in the 14th floor conference room. Richard Crane arrived in a dark suit, with the composed manner of a man who had run the scenario in his head enough times to have a response prepared for every branch. He sat across from Eleanor and 2 outside board members and folded his hands on the table. Eleanor placed the access log in front of him, the maintenance contractor's records, the payment trail from the Delaware Holding Company, the 12-second call recording. She laid each one out in sequence, without commentary. The way you deal cards. Richard's composed manner held through the first document. It held through the second. By the third document it was still present, but had gone very still, the way a fire goes still when something is removed from it. By the fourth, he had stopped looking at the documents and was looking at Eleanor. "This is circumstantial," he said. "The call recording isn't," Eleanor said. He said nothing. The board members asked questions for 20 minutes. Richard answered 3 of them. He did not answer the 4th. His employment was suspended by unanimous consent pending formal investigation. Legal would take over the rest. He was asked to leave his keycard at the desk. Sebastian stood outside the conference room door through all of it. He did not enter. He was not asked to. When Eleanor came out into the corridor, she stood for a moment in the way that people stand when something large and long anticipated has finally become past tense. "Done," she said. He nodded. She looked at him. "You never asked me what was in his file. It wasn't my file to ask about." She was quiet for a moment. Then she went back to her office, and Sebastian went to find Abigail. The lobby of the building caught the late afternoon light and held it in the marble floor, in long amber rectangles. Sebastian came off the elevator with his canvas tote over one shoulder and found Grace and Abigail already there. Grace had picked Abigail up from the care center 2 blocks over, a thing she had volunteered for that morning with no particular ceremony. Abigail was wearing her backpack and holding Biscuit and examining the marble floor with the systematic interest she applied to most surfaces she had not yet catalogued. Eleanor came down 6 minutes later. She was still in the navy blazer, and she was carrying a white envelope. And she crossed the lobby with the same brisk, settled stride she used for everything, except that when she reached Sebastian, she slowed and stopped in a way that was slightly different from professional. Not hesitant, just deliberate. She held out the envelope. He took it. He opened it without asking what it was, which she noticed. He read it in about 40 seconds. He was a fast reader. But he slowed at the second page and read one section twice. The section that outlined health coverage, full family plan, effective on first day of employment. He read it again. He signed on the last line with a pen from his shirt pocket. He handed it back. "When do I start?" he said. "Tomorrow, 8 o'clock. 7:30, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a beat in which the lobby was very quiet, and the amber light was very still. 7:30, she said. Abigail had been watching this exchange from beside Grace with Biscuit tucked under her chin, tracking the conversation the way she tracked most things quietly, completely, missing nothing. When Eleanor turned toward the door, Abigail took 2 steps forward. "Excuse me," she said. Eleanor stopped and looked down. "Are you going to be nice to my dad?" Abigail asked. She asked it the way 6-year-olds ask things. Directly, without softening, as a genuine request for information. Eleanor looked at her for a moment. Then she crouched, not the performance of crouching, not the adult pantomime of getting low, but genuinely down, so that she was at eye level with Abigail's eye level, and the difference between them was nothing. "I'm trying to be," Eleanor said. "I'm still learning how." Abigail considered this answer with the seriousness it deserved. Then she lifted Biscuit and held the bear out in both hands. "You can hold Biscuit for a minute," she said. "Biscuit helps when things are hard." Eleanor took the bear. It sat in her hands small, worn soft, the re-sewn eye looking up at her with its permanent question. Her fingers closed around it slowly. Sebastian had turned away. He was looking at the revolving door, at the city outside, at the cars and the people and the ordinary motion of a Thursday afternoon. His jaw moved once. He stood there for a moment and did not let anyone see his face. Eleanor handed Biscuit back carefully, with both hands. "The way you return something that belongs to someone." "Thank you," she said. Abigail took the bear and nodded, satisfied. She went to Sebastian's side and took his hand. Eleanor stood and looked at the two of them for a moment in the amber light. 7:30, Sebastian said again, without turning around. 7:30, Eleanor said. They walked out through the revolving door into the afternoon. The 3 of them, father, daughter, bear, and the city, did what it always did, which was continue. Nothing on the street had changed. Nothing visible, anyway. But in the lobby behind them, Eleanor Voss stood alone for a moment, with her arms at her sides, looking at the revolving door still settling from their passage, and she did not move toward her car for a little while. Sebastian Cole had walked into that building in the early morning, with a child on his arm, and nothing to prove except the one thing that never fit on a resume. That the shape of a man's life, the weight he carries quietly, the reasons he still shows up, these are not separate from his competence. They are the source of it. He had spent 2 years invisible by choice, building something small and steady out of the wreckage of the life before. Now he had signed a piece of paper that said he could keep doing that and do something else at the same time. Be someone's safety, Be someone's reason the morning runs right. He had not told Abigail yet about the coverage. He would tell her tonight, probably, while she ate her oatmeal and biscuit sat on the table, watching them both with that crooked, questioning eye. She would probably nod and say something exact and go back to her spoon. That was how she was. He held her hand and walked her toward the parking structure and the old Honda and the drive home through the city that was already going dark at the edges, already becoming evening, already becoming the next day. He was 7:30.